There are years that pass quietly, leaving only faint impressions on the pages of history. And then there are years like 2020, years that arrive like a storm, reshaping everything in their path. From the very first days of January to the final, exhausted breath of December, 2020 demanded something from all of us. It asked us to grieve publicly, to mourn collectively, and to reckon with the fragility of the lives we so often take for granted. I'm Steven Siegel, senior editor at legacy.com, and alongside me is Linnea Crowther, Legacy's senior writer. Together, we spent this extraordinary year doing what Legacy has always done, bearing witness to the lives that shaped our world, our culture, our memories, and our hearts. And today, as this difficult year draws to a close, we want to pause. We want to remember. Because every name on this list was more than a headline. Every single one of them was a story. A full, complicated, brilliant human story that deserves to be told with care, and with Love Point 2020 was already a year unlike any other before a single celebrity name appeared in an obituary column. A global pandemic arrived with terrifying speed, touching virtually every corner of the world and claiming lives in numbers that staggered the imagination. It changed the way we said goodbye to people. It changed the way we grieved. Funerals were held without mourners. Memorial services happened on screens. People died alone in hospital rooms, unable to hold the hands they most wanted to hold. And in the middle of all that collective heartbreak, the famous faces we'd grown up with, the musicians who provided the soundtrack to our lives, the actors who made us laugh and cry and think, the athletes who made us believe in something greater than ourselves, they began to leave us too. What follows is our remembrance of some of those remarkable individuals. These are not simply names and dates. These are lives, and they deserve to be remembered as such. January had barely begun before the world felt its first significant sting of loss. On the seventh day of the new year, Neil Peart, the thunderous heartbeat behind the legendary rock band Rush, passed away after a private battle with brain cancer. He was 67 years old. To call Neil Peart simply a drummer would be like calling the ocean simply water. He was, by the overwhelming consensus of musicians and fans alike, one of the most gifted and technically brilliant drummers the world of rock music had ever produced. But beyond his extraordinary skill behind the kit, Peart was also Rush's primary lyricist, a deeply philosophical writer who transformed rock songs into meditations on free will mythology, science, and the human condition. His passing left a silence in the music world that no amount of replaying his recordings could fully fill. Just 2 weeks later, on January 21st, the world of British comedy lost one of its most beloved architects. Terry Jones, co-founder of the legendary troupe Monty Python, died at the age of 77 following a long struggle with dementia. Jones was not merely a performer. He was a director, a scholar, a children's author, and a medieval historian of genuine academic standing. As the director of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Life of Brian, and The Meaning of Life, he helped craft some of the most enduringly funny and intellectually subversive cinema of the 20th century. His ability to blend absurdism with sharp social commentary was a rare and precious gift, and the world became a slightly less funny place without him. In 0.2 days after Terry Jones departed, journalism lost one of its most distinguished voices. Jim Lehrer, the steady and principled co-anchor of PBS NewsHour, died of a heart attack on January 23rd at the age of 85. Over his decades on public television, Lehrer became synonymous with a kind of journalism that now feels almost quaint in its commitment to fairness, depth, and dignity. He moderated 12 presidential debates between 1988 and 2012, a record that speaks to the extraordinary trust the American public placed in him. In an era increasingly defined by noise and partisanship, Jim Lehrer was a reminder of what journalism could be at its very best. And then came January 26, a date that will forever carry a particular weight for basketball fans, and for anyone who has ever watched someone pursue greatness with absolute, unrelenting devotion. Kobe Bryant, one of the most celebrated athletes in the history of professional sports, died in a helicopter crash in the hills of Calabasas, California. He was 41 years old. Also among the 9 people killed in that crash was his 13-year-old daughter, Gianna, along with 7 other passengers and the pilot. The world stopped. Social media went silent in a way it almost never does. Sports arenas across the globe lit up purple, and gold. Kobe had spent 20 seasons with the Los Angeles Lakers, winning 5 NBA championships, earning 18 All-Star selections, and producing moments of athletic brilliance that seemed to defy the physical limits of the human body. But what made the grief so overwhelming was not merely what Kobe had done on the court. It was who he had become off it. In the years following his retirement, he had evolved into a devoted father, a storytelling Oscar winner, and a passionate advocate for women's basketball. He was just beginning a new chapter, and the abrupt, violent end of that chapter left millions of people around the world reeling. Before January had fully spent itself, 2 more profound losses arrived. Novelist Mary Higgins Clark, the woman so rightly crowned a queen of suspense, died on the final day of the month at the remarkable age of 92. With 51 published novels and more than 100 million copies sold, she had built one of the most successful careers in the history of popular fiction. And on February 5th, just days into the new month, Hollywood said goodbye to one of its last true giants. Kirk Douglas, born as Sir Danilovich in 1916, died at the age of 103. His films, Spartacus, Gunfight at the OK Corral, Paths of Glory, 20,000 Leagues Under Sea, were not merely entertainment. They were monuments of American cinema. Douglas was a man who had survived a near-fatal helicopter crash, a stroke, and a century of living, and he had done it all with intensity and a hunger that seemed to burn in him from the inside out as winter deepened. So did the sense that 2020 had arrived with an unusual appetite for the lives of those who had made our world richer. Robert Conrad, the charismatic actor who had played Secret Service agent James West in the beloved 1960s television series The Wild Wild West, died on February 8th of heart failure at 84. His physical confidence and magnetic on-screen presence had made him one of the defining action heroes of his television era on February 11th. The world of music lost Joseph Shabalala, the visionary founder of Ladysmith Black Mambazo, the magnificent South African choral group, whose voices carried the beauty and the sorrow of their homeland to audiences around the globe. Shabalala's collaboration with Paul Simon on the 1986 album Graceland had introduced millions of Western listeners to the transcendent power of South African isothermia and imbued music. He was 79 years old. February also brought the death of NASA mathematician Katherine Johnson on the 24th, at the age of 101. Though her name had not been widely known for most of her life, the 2016 film Hidden Figures had finally brought her extraordinary contributions to the American space program into the light they had always deserved. Johnson's mathematical calculations, performed by hand with breathtaking precision, had been essential to the success of the earliest American space missions. She was a pioneer of the highest order, and her passing closed a chapter of American history that deserves never be forgotten. March arrived, and with it came the loss of Kenny Rogers on the 20th, a death that felt, in the kindest way possible, like the natural conclusion of a life extraordinarily well-lived. Rogers had spent more than 6 decades in the music industry, accumulating hit after hit, and earning a place in the permanent affections of country music fans around the world. The Gambler, his signature song, had become something more than a country music hit. It had become a piece of American folk wisdom, a set of life lessons delivered in a narrative so perfectly constructed that it felt less like a song and more like a parable. He died of natural causes at the age of 81, surrounded by family. Singer and songwriter Bill Withers followed on March 30th, leaving behind a catalog of songs so simple, so warm, and so deeply human that they seem less like compositions and more like natural phenomena, things that must have always existed, waiting for someone wise enough to discover them. Lean on Me, Ain't No Sunshine, Lovely Day, these were not merely popular songs. They were emotional necessities, hymns for the secular world. Withers died of heart complications at 81, and the world grieved with particular tenderness, because his music had always felt like a friend. April is when the shadow of COVID-19 fell darkest across this particular story. The pandemic, which had been gathering terrible momentum since early in the year, began claiming lives that the wider world recognized and mourned publicly. On April 1st, a date that felt cruelly ironic, 2 remarkable musicians died on the very same day. Adam Schlesinger, the brilliantly versatile songwriter and co-founder of Fountains of Wayne, died of COVID-19 at just 52 years old. Schlesinger had an extraordinary creative range, writing catchy pop rock anthems and earning Emmy and Grammy nominations for his television and film work. His loss, at such a relatively young age, felt particularly brutal on that same April 1st. Ellis Marsalis, patriarch of one of jazz's most celebrated families and a revered mentor in the New Orleans musical community, also died of COVID-19 at 85. His sons Branford and Wynton had become among the most acclaimed jazz musicians of their generation, in no small part because of the musical education and moral grounding their father had provided. Ellis Marsalis was a root from which a remarkable musical family tree had grown, and his death was mourned deeply throughout the jazz world. 6 days later, on April 7th, folk singer John Prine, a songwriter, a writer of such exquisite emotional precision that Bob Dylan himself had named him as an influence, died of complications from COVID-19 at 73. Prine had spent decades writing songs that captured the inner lives of ordinary people with an empathy and a wit that few songwriters in any genre have ever matched. His passing provoked an outpouring of grief from the musical community that was extraordinary even by the standards of a year already full of extraordinary grief. The warmer months brought no relief. May delivered the death of little Richard on the 9th. And if any death in 2020 carried the weight of a true ending of an era, it was this one. Little Richard was not merely a rock and roll pioneer. He was, in a very real sense, rock and roll itself, its spirit, its energy, its defiant joy, its refusal to be contained. When he screamed, "A wop bopaloo bopalop bam boom," at the opening of Tutti Frutti, he was not performing a song. He was announcing a new world. He was 87 when he died of bone cancer, and the music he had made more than 60 years earlier still sounded like the future. June brought the loss of Carl Reiner, who died on the 29th at the magnificent age of 98. Reiner had created and starred in The Dick Van Dyke Show, one of the most beloved and influential sitcoms in the history of American television. His lifelong comedy partnership with Mel Brooks had produced some of the funniest recordings ever made, and his son, Rob Reiner, had carried the family's creative legacy into his own extraordinary filmmaking career. Carl Reiner died as he had lived, surrounded by love, full of laughter, and profoundly connected to the people who mattered most to him. July brought an almost unbearable accumulation. On the 8th, actress Naya Rivera, who had brought such fierce intelligence and heartbreaking vulnerability to her role as Santana Lopez on Glee, drowned at just 33 years old in a California lake. Her young son was found safe on the boat they had rented. The manner of her death was devastating and in particular cruelty, and the grief of her Glee castmates and fans was raw and visible in a way that cut through even the numbing weight of the year's accumulated losses. That on July 17th, Congressman John Lewis, a man whose moral courage had helped shape the arc of American history, died of pancreatic cancer at the age of 80. Lewis had been beaten bloody on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965. He had helped organize a march on Washington where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his immortal speech. He had spent 33 years in Congress representing the state of Georgia. He had never stopped marching, never stopped speaking, never stopped insisting that the work of justice was unfinished. At his passing, President Barack Obama called him an American whose race was run with honor. The nation wept. August delivered perhaps the single most shocking death of the entire year. Shocking not merely because of who it was, but because almost no one had known it was coming. Chadwick Boseman, the luminous actor who had portrayed Jackie Robinson, James Brown, Thurgood Marshall, and T'Challa, the Black Panther, died on August 28th of colon cancer. He was 43 years old. The world had not known he was ill. He had been diagnosed in 2016 and had spent the final 4 years of his life making movie after movie, playing hero after hero, while carrying the private weight of a terminal illness with a grace and a discipline that was, in retrospect, the most heroic performance of all. The grief that followed the announcement of his death was immediate, global, and profound, for young black audiences in particular, who had seen themselves reflected in the power and dignity of the Black Panther with an intensity that no superhero film had previously achieved. The loss felt personal in a way that few celebrity deaths ever do. September brought the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the 18th, a death that carried not only personal grief but immediate political consequence. Ginsburg, who had served on the United States Supreme Court since 1993, had become in her later years something rare and remarkable, a genuine popular icon known as a notorious RBG. Beloved by millions who admired her fierce intellect, her unflinching commitment to equality, and her refusal to retreat from the bench despite serious health challenges. She died of metastatic pancreatic cancer at 87, and within hours of her passing, the political battle over her replacement had already begun. But beneath the politics, there was grief, real, deep, personal grief from millions of people who had looked to her and seen something worth protecting. October took Eddie Van Halen on the 6th, and with him went one of the most distinctive and influential guitar sounds in the history of rock music. Van Halen's playing had been a revelation when it first emerged in the late 1970s, a style so technically advanced and yet so joyfully exuberant that it seemed to expand the very definition of what the electric guitar could do. His solos on songs like Eruption had left an entire generation of guitarists staring at their instruments in disbelief and delight. He was 65 when he died of throat cancer, and on Halloween, in a final, darkly appropriate flourish from a year that seemed to have a taste of theatrical, Sean Connery died at the age of 90. Connery had been the first and, for many, the definitive James Bond. Suave, dangerous, charming, and utterly magnetic. But Bond had been only one chapter in a career of extraordinary range and longevity, a career crowned by an Academy Award for The Untouchables and defined by a willingness to take risks and defy expectations that kept him relevant and compelling for more than half a century. November brought the death of Alex Trebek on the 8th, a loss that was expected, since Trebek had publicly shared his pancreatic cancer diagnosis more than a year earlier, but which landed with enormous emotional weight. Nonetheless, for 37 years, Trebek had presided over Jeopardy, with a wit, a warmth, and an intellectual elegance that made him one of the most beloved presences in American television. He had hosted the show until just weeks before his death, and the grace with which he had faced his illness had earned him a new dimension of public admiration. He was 80 years old, and the game show landscape he left behind felt irreversibly different without him. December arrived and brought with it the death of Charlie Pride, the first black superstar country music, on the 12th of COVID-19 at 86. Pride had broken through racial barriers in one of America's most stubbornly segregated musical genres, achieving 30 number one songs on the country charts and earning a place in the Country Music Hall of Fame. That a man who had dedicated his life to a genre of music that had not always welcomed him should die of a pandemic that had itself disproportionately claimed black lives felt, to many, like a particularly painful final injustice. Also on the 12th, author John le Carré, the master of the modern spy novel, a writer whose work had dignified and complicated the thriller genre for more than half a century, died of pneumonia at 89.